There's a myth that refuses to die. You've probably heard it before. Japan had no tanks in World War II. Or worse, Japanese tanks were useless. It's repeated so often that it feels true. And because the phrase sounds logical, because we associate tanks with Europe, with Germany, and the Soviet Union, it goes unchallenged. But the reality is far more complicated. Japan didn't just field tanks during World War II. They built thousands of them. They designed multiple classes. They deployed armor across China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and Manchuria. So why don't they appear in popular memory? Because Japanese tanks weren't built for the war most people imagine. They weren't designed to fight Shermans in open fields. They weren't meant to duel tigers across wide plains. They were built for a different war, one Japan had already been fighting for years. This is the story of every major Japanese tank used in World War II. Not why they failed, but why they existed, and what happened when the war outgrew the doctrine that created them. Type 94 Tankette. Japan's armored story begins small. The Type 94 Tankette was barely a tank at all, weighing just over 3 tons, crewed by 2 men, and armed with a single machine gun. It offered almost no protection. Its armor could barely stop rifle fire. But survivability wasn't the point. The Type 94 was built for infantry support in China and Manchuria, where opposing forces lacked effective anti-tank weapons. It could cross rough terrain, suppress resistance, and intimidate enemy soldiers who had never faced armor before. It was cheap, it was simple, and thousands were built. For years, it worked. But as the war expanded, a machine gun tankette could only take Japan so far. Type 95 Hago, Japan's most famous tank, and its most misunderstood, was the Type 95 Hago. Over 2,300 were produced, making it the backbone of Japan's armored forces. Light, mechanically reliable, and easy to maintain, the Hago was designed to operate where heavier tanks couldn't. Narrow jungle paths, poor roads, and island terrain. Armed with a 37mm gun and thin armor, it excelled against infantry and lightly equipped forces. In Malaya, Hago tanks spearheaded rapid advances that shocked British defenders unprepared for armor in jungle warfare. But success created a dangerous illusion. Against American Shermans, the Hago was hopelessly outmatched. On Tarawa, Saipan, and beyond, Hago crews faced tanks that could destroy them from ranges they couldn't respond to. Yet the Hago remained in service until 1945, not because it was effective, but because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace it. Type 89 Igo. The Type 89 Igo represented Japan's early attempt at a medium tank. Introduced in 1929, it mounted a short-barreled 57mm gun and heavier armor than Japan's light tanks. In China during the 1930s, it performed adequately against minimal opposition. But by the time World War II began, the Type 89 was already obsolete. Slow, poorly armored, and undergunned, it was relegated to secondary duties. Japan kept it in service not out of confidence, but necessity. Type 97 Chi-Ha. The Type 97 Chi-Ha was Japan's most important medium tank of the early war. Designed for operations in Manchuria, it emphasized mobility and infantry support. Its 57mm gun fired effective high-explosive shells, but lacked armor-piercing power. That flaw became obvious during clashes with Soviet forces at Kokengol in 1939, where Japanese tanks were decisively outgunned. Japan tried to adapt. Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha. The Shinhoto Chi-Ha replaced the original gun with a longer 47mm weapon capable of defeating light armor. It was an improvement, but it arrived too late. By the time Shinhoto tanks reached the Pacific in meaningful numbers, they faced Shermans whose armor they could rarely penetrate. Crews dug them into defensive positions, using them as static bunkers rather than mobile weapons. It was a sign that Japanese tank doctrine was collapsing under the weight of modern warfare. Type 2 Kami. Japan's geography shaped its designs. The Type 2 Kami amphibious tank was built for island assaults. Fitted with detachable pontoons, it could swim ashore and provide immediate fire support. In theory, it was ideal. In practice, it was slow, vulnerable, and easily destroyed before reaching land. Those that did land were quickly eliminated by superior Allied firepower. Type 3 Kachi. The Type 3 Kachi was a larger amphibious successor to the Kami. Only 19 were built. It arrived too late, in too few numbers to matter. Type 4 Chi-Ha. Type 4 Chi-Ha was the most advanced medium tank design. Armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and equipped with sloped armor, the Chi-Ha was Japan's answer to the Sherman. On paper, it was competitive. It could penetrate Sherman armor at reasonable ranges. Its design incorporated lessons learned from years of combat. But only 6 were ever completed. Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing. Raw materials were scarce. Factories were being bombed. The Chi-Ha never saw combat. It existed as a testament to what Japan could have built if they'd started earlier, prioritized armor development, and possessed the industrial base to produce it in meaningful numbers. Type 5 Chiri. Even more ambitious was the Type 5 Chiri, a heavy tank mounting multiple guns. Only one prototype was finished before the war ended. Type 1 Hoenai, 1, 2, 3. Japan's solution to tank inferiority was adaptation. The Hoenai series mounted large guns on existing Chi-Ha chassis. Open-topped and lightly armored, they were intended as mobile artillery and tank destroyers. They saw limited combat, but remained vulnerable to air attack and counterfire. Other light and reserve tanks like the Type 98 Kuenai, Type 3 Chinu, and experimental designs existed largely on paper or in reserve units. Many were held back for the defense of the Japanese home islands. They never fought. Why Japanese tanks failed? Japanese tanks didn't fail because of incompetence. They failed because they were built for the wrong war. Japan prioritized naval power and air dominance. Armor was secondary. When the Pacific War became an industrial, mechanized conflict, Japanese tanks were left behind. Bravery couldn't compensate for doctrine, and doctrine couldn't compensate for industry. Japanese tanks weren't useless. They were contextual. In the environments they were designed for, against the enemies they were meant to fight, they worked. But war is unforgiving. And when the context changed, when the enemies grew stronger, when the industrial base couldn't keep pace, context stopped mattering. The story of Japanese tanks is a reminder that weapons are only as good as the strategy that employs them and the industry that sustains them. Japan built thousands of tanks. They just built them for the wrong war. If you're interested in more deep dives into the armored vehicles, aircraft, and naval forces of World War II, explore the rest of this channel. We cover the machines that shaped history with the seriousness and depth they deserve. Consider subscribing if you value historically grounded military analysis. And thank you for watching.